I never should have gone inside that hospital. It had been abandoned for decades, left to rot at the edge of town, and everyone knew to stay away. The stories people told about it were enough to keep most folks out, whispers of strange noises, shadows moving in the windows, and a darkness that seemed to swallow anything that got too close. But I let curiosity get the better of me. I had to see it for myself. The entrance was barely holding together, its rusted doors hanging open just enough to let me slip inside. As soon as I stepped in, the air changed. It was thick, stagnant, carrying the scent of decay and mold. The walls were peeling, revealing layers of forgotten time, and the flickering remnants of old fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, as if the hospital still had some flicker of life left in it. I moved cautiously down the hall, my flashlight barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. The silence was absolute, except for the occasional drip of water echoing somewhere deeper inside. Every step I took felt intrusive, like I was disturbing something that had long been left undisturbed. Old gurneys and rusted wheelchairs were scattered along the corridor, their shadows stretching unnaturally against the walls as my light passed over them. I reached the reception area, where a massive desk still stood, covered in dust and debris. Files lay scattered across the floor, some open as if someone had been rifling through them before vanishing into thin air. The names on the papers meant nothing to me, but the dates, some from over 50 years ago, sent a chill down my spine. Then I heard it. A soft shuffle, like the sound of bare feet dragging against the tile. My blood ran cold. I turned my flashlight toward the noise, but the beam trembled as I struggled to keep my hand steady. Down the hall, past a set of broken double doors, I swore I saw movement. A shadow, just at the edge of my vision, disappearing around the corner. I should have left. I should have turned around and run. But I didn't. Something compelled me forward, deeper into the hospital. My breath came in short, shallow bursts as I moved past empty patient rooms, their beds still unmade, some with restraints hanging limply from the sides. The feeling of being watched grew stronger with every step, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on me like an unbearable force. Then the whispering started. It was faint at first, like a breeze slipping through the cracks in the walls. But as I moved forward, the voices became clearer, hushed, urgent murmurs that seemed to surround me. They came from everywhere and nowhere at once, an overlapping chorus of indistinct words that sent ice through my veins. A door creaked open ahead of me. I stopped in my tracks, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. The room beyond was shrouded in darkness, but something inside shifted. My flashlight flickered, the beam dimming as if something was leaching the energy from it. And then I saw them. Figures, barely visible in the gloom. Their outlines wavered, like distorted reflections in rippling water. Their faces were obscured, but I could feel their eyes locked onto me. They stood in silence, watching, waiting. My legs refused to move. Fear rooted me to the spot, paralyzing every muscle in my body. Then, as one, they stepped forward. The whispering rose to a deafening cacophony, words blending together into an overwhelming tide of sound. Run. The command exploded in my mind, and I finally obeyed. I turned and bolted, sprinting back through the halls as the whispers followed me, growing sharper, angrier. Doors slammed shut as I passed, the building itself seeming to twist and change, warping into a maze designed to keep me trapped. I burst through the front doors, stumbling onto the cracked pavement outside. The moment I crossed the threshold, the whispers stopped. The air was still again, the night impossibly quiet. I turned back, expecting to see something, someone, watching me from the darkness. But the hospital stood as it always had, empty, silent, waiting. I never went back. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear them. The whispers. Calling my name. Years passed, and the hospital remained untouched, its eerie presence looming over the town. But one fateful night, a group of children dared each other to enter. They were young, barely teenagers, fueled by adrenaline and the thrill of breaking the unspoken rule of staying away. Tommy, Sarah, and Jake stood before the rusted entrance, their flashlights casting long, wavering beams into the gaping maw of the hospital. "Just a quick look," Tommy whispered, his voice betraying his uncertainty. Sarah swallowed hard. "I don't like this," she admitted, but peer pressure kept her rooted to the spot. Jake, the bravest, or perhaps the most foolish, of the trio, took the first step inside. "Come on," he urged. "We'll be legends." The moment they crossed the threshold, the air thickened, wrapping around them like a suffocating shroud. The hospital seemed alive, pulsing with a presence that lurked just beyond their sight. The children hesitated, but their curiosity won out, and they pressed forward. As they ventured deeper, the air grew colder, and a metallic scent filled their noses. Then, from the depths of the building, a low, guttural moan echoed. The children froze. A shadow lurched from the darkness, a figure, its flesh rotting, eyes clouded with a milky haze. A sickly, wet gurgle escaped its throat as it dragged itself toward them, arms twitching, fingers clawing at the air. Sarah screamed. Jake grabbed Tommy's arm. "Run!" They turned and sprinted back the way they came, but the halls twisted and shifted, just as they had for me years ago. The whispers rose, growing frenzied, urging the creature forward. The zombie, its body racked with decay, was faster than it should have been. It reached for them, its bony fingers brushing Sarah's shoulder. The doors were in sight. They pushed themselves harder, lungs burning, and then they were out. The night was silent. The hospital stood still. The whispers ceased. Panting, the children turned back, expecting to see the monster emerging from the doorway. But there was nothing. Jake swallowed. "We never speak of this again." But the whispers never forgot. The children ran home, shaken and breathless, but their ordeal wasn't over. The next morning, Sarah's parents noticed her pale complexion and trembling hands. She muttered about something following them, something that hadn't stayed behind. Panicked, the parents called the police. Within hours, a squad car arrived at the hospital, its red and blue lights flashing against the crumbling facade. 2 officers stepped inside, their radios crackling. Then the screaming started. More figures lurched from the darkness, their twisted, rotting forms closing in. The officers fired their weapons, but the bullets barely slowed the creatures down. The town never heard from them again. The morning after Sarah, Jake, and Tommy barely escaped the hospital, the town began to stir with whispers of their terror. At first, the adults dismissed their wild claims as the overactive imaginations of teenagers. But when Sarah's pale complexion and trembling hands didn't subside, when her quiet mutterings grew more urgent, something following her, there was no denying something was wrong. Sarah's parents took her to the doctor, but the concern was quickly replaced by panic. The doctor's examination revealed nothing physically wrong, but something lingered in Sarah's eyes, a dark, empty stare that unsettled even the most seasoned professionals. She spoke little, only repeating fragments of a story no one could truly understand. Her words felt wrong, as if they were not hers at all. That night, after hours of unsettling silence, Sarah screamed from her bedroom. Her parents rushed in to find her wide-eyed and shaking, whispering in terror. "They're coming, they're still coming," she muttered between sobs, her hands gripping the sheets so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her mother grabbed the phone, her hands trembling. "We need help. We need to call the police." The police, already on edge from the reports earlier that morning, responded quickly. They knew something had happened at the hospital, but no one was ready to face the truth of what had been unleashed. Officer Daniels, a grizzled veteran, had heard the stories about the old hospital, about the strange things that people said had occurred there over the years, but he'd never imagined it could be real. Yet here they were, 3 kids claiming to have seen monsters, the kind that didn't belong in this world. Still, he and his partner, Officer Bennett, had been on worse calls. Or so they thought. Arriving at Sarah's house, they saw the family in disarray. Sarah's father tried to calm his daughter, but his hands shook too. The police officers didn't need to be told where to go, the children had been inside the hospital, and there was only one place where they'd all come from. They had to return. They had to find out if the children were right. They had to stop whatever it was that had taken root there. The officers gathered a small team, 4 of them, all armed, all seasoned. They weren't expecting to be heroes, but they had to try. Officer Daniels led the way, a flashlight in one hand, his weapon gripped tightly in the other. The others followed, stepping cautiously behind him, their boots crunching the dead leaves scattered on the ground. The hospital loomed in the distance, its silhouette jagged against the twilight sky. The doors, half rusted and hanging on their hinges, beckoned them forward. "Stay close. We don't know what's in there," Officer Daniels ordered, his voice steady but his eyes betraying his nerves. They crossed the threshold, stepping into the stale air of the hospital. Immediately, a strange weight settled over them, and they each exchanged uneasy glances. The silence was unnerving, thick enough to be cut with a knife. No sounds, no creaks or groans of an old building settling, just the emptiness of the place, like it had never been disturbed. They advanced down the same hallway the children had walked just hours before. The faintest drip of water echoed in the distance, as though mocking them. The air was cold, too cold for a building that should have been abandoned for decades. Officer Bennett shuddered, his breath misting in the air. "Should we call for backup?" Officer Morgan asked, her voice tight with concern. "Backup won't help," Daniels replied grimly. "We're here to find out what's happening. If there's a threat, we deal with it ourselves." They reached the reception area, the same spot where the children had found the old files scattered across the floor. The papers were still there, untouched, but the air seemed heavier, thicker. A flicker of movement at the edge of Daniels's vision caught his attention, but when he turned, there was nothing. "Did you see that?" Bennett asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. Daniels nodded slowly, his grip tightening on his flashlight. "We need to keep moving. Stay alert." They passed the doors the children had seen the shadows disappear behind, and that's when it happened. A noise, a sharp, screeching cry, came from deeper in the building. It was a wail, distorted and guttural, like a dying animal or a tortured soul. And then came the shuffle, the sound of feet dragging across the floor, slow and deliberate. But there were many feet. The shuffling multiplied, echoing down the hall from all directions. Before anyone could react, the first figure appeared. A twisted, grotesque form stumbled out from the shadows. Its skin was sagging, hanging in wet, rotting patches. Its face was a hollow, empty shell, its eyes glazed over in an unnatural, milky white. The officers froze. Then, more figures appeared, dragging their decayed bodies toward them. The creatures shuffled and groaned, their twisted limbs reaching out, their mouths open in a silent scream. "Fall back!" Daniels shouted, but it was too late. The zombies closed in. Their hands were gnarled claws, their mouths dripping with rot. Officer Bennett fired, but his bullets seemed to have no effect. The creatures kept coming, relentless in their pursuit. The officers fired again and again, but the bullets only slowed them down, barely piercing the rotting flesh. It wasn't enough. Officer Morgan stumbled back, her leg caught by one of the creatures. It grabbed hold of her ankle, pulling her down with an unnatural strength. She screamed, and Daniels rushed to her aid, but another figure lunged at him. His flashlight dropped to the floor, its beam flickering uselessly. Bennett reached for the radio, but before he could speak, he was overwhelmed. The creatures were too fast. They dragged him down with terrifying swiftness. Daniels pulled Morgan to her feet, but it was no use. The hospital had become a maze, the hallways shifting and twisting as if the building itself was alive, trapping them inside. The creatures surrounded them, their breath foul and rancid, their hands clawing at their uniforms. Morgan screamed, her voice raw with terror, as she tried to push forward, but the floor beneath them shifted. One of the zombies lunged at her, its hands wrapping around her throat. Daniels fired again, but the shot was too late. She was gone. In the chaos, Daniels turned and ran. He sprinted down the hallway, the pounding footsteps of the zombies following him, growing louder and louder, echoing in his mind. He had to make it out. He had to warn everyone. His heart pounded in his chest as he stumbled, desperate to reach the exit. He could see the door ahead of him, the one that would lead him back into the night, into the safety of the outside world. But as he reached for it, the door slammed shut. Behind him, the whispers began. They rose from the depths of the building, filling his mind with 1,000 voices, all speaking at once, all demanding something he couldn't understand. He turned, his hand still on the door, and in the shadows, he saw the creatures closing in. And then, in the darkness, the world went silent. Outside, the town waited. The squad car remained parked at the entrance to the hospital, its lights flashing but its officers nowhere to be seen. The whispers continued, no longer just in the hospital, but drifting into the streets. The town could feel the darkness spreading, the cold creeping further and further with every passing moment. No one knew what had really happened inside the hospital that night. No one except the ones who had gone in. And the creatures waiting within. The town had always been small, quiet, a place where everyone knew everyone else's name, and the worst danger was a fender bender on the main road. But now, the shadows of the abandoned hospital spread like an infection, slowly creeping into every corner of the town. It wasn't just the whispers anymore. People spoke of strange figures glimpsed out of the corner of their eyes, of windows that opened by themselves, of doors that creaked open when no one was near. The town was slowly suffocating under the weight of its own fear. The next morning, the police cars never returned. Neither did the squad car, or the officers. When their radios went silent, the town's sheriff, a grizzled man named Sheriff Harrison, decided it was time to investigate. But as he drove toward the old hospital with a heavy heart, his mind kept returning to something Sarah had said the night before. "They're still coming." The hospital stood, just as it always had, decaying, desolate, waiting. But now, the air around it felt thicker, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Sheriff Harrison stepped out of his car and glanced at the darkened windows of the building. There was no wind, no movement, just the silence. His hand hovered near his weapon, but for some reason, it felt like even the gun wouldn't be enough. He swallowed hard, stepping forward. The doors groaned open on their own, as if inviting him in. His boots scraped against the dirt and grime inside. His flashlight cut through the dark, revealing the familiar hallway, the same hallway the children, the officers, had walked. But now, it felt different. Cold. Hungry. The walls seemed to pulse with an unseen life, the air so thick with rot and decay that it made his chest tighten. Each step he took seemed to drag him deeper into the building, as though the hospital itself was pulling him in, wrapping its tendrils around his mind. He reached the reception area and knelt down, studying the papers scattered on the floor, same as the children had described. But now, something was wrong. The dates weren't just old. They were too old. Some of the names were barely legible, as if time itself had eaten away at them. Then he heard it. A slow, dragging sound from behind him, like something crawling across the floor. His heart skipped a beat. The flashlight trembled in his hand as he turned, scanning the darkness. And there it was. A figure, tall and unnaturally thin, standing at the end of the hall. Its limbs were too long, bending at grotesque angles. Its skin was pulled tight, as if the flesh had been stretched over bone and left to rot in the sun. Its eyes, clouded, blind, stared ahead, unblinking, but somehow it saw him. Then came the others. Figures, emerging from the shadows, stepping out of the walls themselves, as if they were woven from the darkness. Their faces were twisted, some were human, others, not quite. Their eyes were glassy, staring into his soul, and their mouths hung open in silent screams. Sheriff Harrison's blood ran cold. He tried to back away, but his legs felt like they were sinking into the floor. His breath caught in his throat. The creatures began to move, slow at first, but then faster, dragging themselves toward him with horrifying speed. His weapon was useless. The creatures didn't react to the shots. Instead, they only moved faster. He turned, running, fleeing into the maze of corridors, his footsteps echoing loudly in the silence. The building seemed to shift around him, twisting and warping, changing direction. He was lost. The walls stretched out, the doors slammed shut, blocking his way. A scream echoed through the hall, sharp, desperate, full of pure terror. It was then that Sheriff Harrison realized, the whispers weren't just voices. They were memories. The hospital had taken every soul it had ever touched, absorbed them into the darkness, making them part of the twisted whole. Those who entered, like the officers, the children, would never leave. They would become another voice in the eternal chorus of torment. He reached another door, pushing it open with frantic hands. On the other side, he could see the faint glow of daylight seeping through the cracks. He could make it. But just as his foot hit the threshold, he felt something cold wrap around his ankle, pulling him back. He screamed, but the sound was muffled, drowned by the thunderous pounding of his own heart. He looked down, it was her. Sarah. Her pale face stared up at him, her eyes hollow, dark circles underneath. She wasn't herself. She couldn't be. The girl he had known was gone, replaced by something far worse. She whispered, her voice low, distorted, "They never leave." A cold hand wrapped around his throat, and he was pulled back into the depths of the hospital. The last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed him whole was the figures, dozens of them, growing in number, emerging from the shadows like night itself had come alive. And they were all looking at him. Back in the town, the sun set behind the hospital, casting long, eerie shadows across the streets. No one dared go near the place anymore. The whispers had spread beyond the hospital's walls. They were in the trees, in the wind, in the cracks of the pavement. People stopped leaving their homes after dark. But it wasn't the whispers that haunted them most. It was the fact that, every night, someone new was missing. The sheriff had disappeared without a trace. The officers were gone. The children had vanished. No one knew what had happened to them, only that they were no longer in the town, no longer in the world. The hospital was still standing, waiting for the next curious soul to wander in, to be consumed by its hunger. And as the years passed, the whispers grew louder. "Come closer. You're next." No one had dared enter the hospital again, until one day, when a small group of teenagers, foolish and full of bravado, gathered outside the rusted doors. They had heard the stories, the warnings, the legends. But they didn't believe. Not until they stepped inside. And the doors slammed shut behind them. And the whispers began again.